welcome to the second SALURBAL remote annual meeting, segunda reunión anual virtual de SALURBAL. And we're going to do introductions in small groups because we have a lot of team members, and on Zoom it can be a little bit tedious to do it one by one. So as always, feel free to speak whatever language you would like to speak, and we will translate. Siéntanse libres de hablar en castellano, en portugués también, y traduciremos, haremos la traducción posterior o simultánea o lo que sea. Here's our agenda for today. As you know, we'll talk more about what happens next time, but today we're going to be, first of all, just a quick agenda review for today and tomorrow, and then we're going to do some introductions in small groups. Claire is going to put us into small groups for a few minutes, and then to get us started, I'm going to share with you a summary of some of the empirical SALURBAL results to date, focusing, as a caveat, this is focusing on our aim 1 of our project. We will be talking about aims 2 and 3 and 4 in more detail at subsequent meetings. So this is the agenda for today. It's quite, it's going to be quite packed, but we hope that we'll get through it. So first, this morning, as I said, I'll do an overview, and then we'll have some time for Q&A, then we'll have a short break. Then we're going to talk about L3 data, which has become available recently after a lot of hard work by everybody. And so we'll be, having some brainstorming reflections on what is possible with this exciting new data. Then we'll have some works in progress presentations. It was hard to choose these, so there are many things we could have chosen. So we tried to select people who perhaps were doing work that was highly relevant to the future of SALURBAL, or work that was ready to be presented, etc. Then there's a time for some informal socializing too, remote, unfortunately, but and then we'll wrap up. Thursday, we'll start out with a review of longitudinal data, which is another set of data that we are very actively working on compiling. We still have some work to do because it's, as usual, it's quite complicated, but some time to talk about what we might do with that data, and then another works in progress presentation, and finally a few closing words. And also here we'll be presenting the coveted SALURBAL award for making the impossible possible. So stay tuned for that. Did I get anything wrong, Claire?
No, that was all right.
Good, thank you. I think right now we're going to go into small groups, right, Claire? And then we'll be back in a few minutes. So
yeah, so we wanted to do the introductions in small groups. So I'm just breaking you all into small groups, and you can just say your name and where you're from, and then answer one of the, or whatever you want to say about yourself. But some questions you could answer are: what was your first job? What is your favorite SALURBAL variable? Or what book are you reading right now? Sorry, I'm trying to manually assign the groups because I wanted to mix people up, and it's taking longer than I thought it would. Just give me. Hold on a second. This is my first time doing breakout groups, and it's not going well. Okay, sorry, everybody. In 30 seconds, I will break everyone into breakout rooms. I apologize.
Okay, you can see my screen again, right? Okay.
You just need to swap the displays again.
Oh, really? That's weird because I see it. I see it. I have two. Is that better?
Yeah, now we can see the slideshow.
Okay, I have two screens, so it's a little confusing. Okay, so, well, just one quick thing. I just want to say it's great to see everyone, even virtually, and it's always great to see that we have new people always joining the group, and that is wonderful. So I want to welcome everyone who has not been part of these meetings before, and also it's also great to see, us expanding. I saw several team members of the heat study also joining, and so I really want to welcome everybody. It's great to have all of your input and all of your energy in this project. So I'm going to do, this is going to be, I warn you, it's going to be a little bit of a whirlwind tour. It's going to be a lot of words, but it was actually very, very interesting to put this together. And Claire, of course, carried the lion's share of this. Basically, we reviewed all the SALURBAL published papers or papers that have been approved by the publications committee, even if they are not yet published. So, and we organized, building on something that we had done last year, we organized the findings into several groups. And I'm going to share with you a summary of some of the key findings so that we can see what we have discovered so far, and also talk a little bit about some opportunities for the future. And again, it's a lot of material very quickly, but this should be, hopefully this will be the beginning of a conversation about this. We have also sent around to you the actual documents themselves, so that you can look at them more calmly, and they have a little more detail even than what I'm going to present. But I think it's helpful to see that, and it will also help us tell the SALURBAL story of the findings for this first phase of SALURBAL. And I just want to emphasize that I will be talking about aim one in particular, as I said earlier. So we are not presenting all of the findings from the other aims. But before I do that, just a quick overview of SALURBAL by the numbers, because it's interesting to see some of these numbers. We've had 51 monthly team meetings. Yes, it's been a lot of team meetings. 60, yeah.
We're not seeing the slides advance, sorry.
Oh my gosh, okay. It must be something related to my, okay, I know. How about this? Can you see it now?
Okay, now we can see it.
Okay, I just have to use my other computer. So 68 executive committee meetings, data contributed by 37 different institutions. How many is that? 21 million death records and over 1 million health survey responses harmonized, thousands of variables developed, over 50 code books, 195 proposals approved by the publications committee, 98 manuscripts submitted to the publications committee, 53 papers accepted and published, and more than 500 proposals and manuscript reviews submitted to the PNP. A big thank you to everyone who is doing these reviews on a regular basis to help us support the work, the quality work of SALURBAL. And over $100,000 in open access publication costs, which were reimbursed by Wellcome Trust for papers that we have published. More, 62 stakeholders in 10 countries engaged in 3 systems workshops, nearly 450 adolescents in Lima told us what snacks they would buy under different conditions. Over 3,000 RUCAS participants in Puente Alto and Viña del Mar. 10 communities in Belo Horizonte included in the Vila Viva evaluation. Nearly 4,000 observations of temporary and permanent bike lanes in Mexico City. 600 photographs captured in Ciudad Bolivar by citizen scientists, data from nearly 350,000 traffic collisions in Mexico City analyzed, 10 SALURBAL dissemination webinars, 1,500 Twitter followers, 50 Salur blog posts, so check them out, and many policy actors, community members, and other members of the public learned about SALURBAL aims and research findings in various activities. So I think there's a lot for us to be proud of. There are more numbers that we could add here, but this gives us a good idea of the breadth of the work. So let me jump right into some of the research findings. So we've organized this into 4 buckets: results using vital statistics data, results using survey data, other built environment analyses, and other social environment analyses. So here's where the whirlwind tour begins. So vital statistics data, what have been some of the key findings so far? Well, first is that life expectancy and mortality vary significantly across cities, even cities within countries, and are associated with city factors. Life expectancy and proportionate mortality by cause are highly heterogeneous across Latin American cities and are associated with various characteristics. Significant variations in life expectancy, not just between, but also within countries, with differences as large as 7 to 10 years. Cause-specific mortality also varies across cities. Some causes of death, like unintentional and violent injuries and deaths, vary a lot within countries, and others vary less within countries. Better city levels of education, water access, sanitation, and less overcrowding are linked to higher life expectancy, a lower proportion of communicable maternal, prenatal, and nutritional conditions, a higher proportion of cancer and cardiovascular diseases and other non-communicable disease deaths. Denser cities have more mortality by violent injuries, and less fragmented and more connected cities had higher proportion of communicable disease and neonatal deaths. And larger cities had shorter life expectancy for men and a relatively higher proportionate mortality by violence. So already some interesting patterns here. We also saw that the relationship of city size with mortality differs by cause. In the cases of some causes of death, we see higher rates in larger cities. But in the case of other causes of death, we see either no relationship or actually the opposite. As city size increases, the rate of death for that particular cause increases. So these are very interesting descriptive results that could point to, future analyses. Economic fluctuations affect mortality too. Increases in GDP are associated with increases in total mortality and in mortality due to CVD, cancer, diabetes, respiratory infections, and road traffic. But the opposite is observed for homicide rates. This is similar to what has been reported in other settings. Road traffic and homicide mortality. We had some papers focusing specifically on these outcomes. Road traffic mortality also varies significantly across cities. It's lower in cities with higher density, higher street connectivity, and a mass transit system. It's lower in cities with higher GDP, and it's higher in cities with more isolated built-up areas. So you can see how a lot of this makes sense. Homicide mortality also varies substantially across cities. Higher subsidy education, higher GDP, lower Gini are associated with lower youth and young adult homicide rates, whereas higher isolation was associated with higher rates. Larger cities and more dense cities also have higher youth and young adult homicide rates, especially in men. And Brazilian cities with higher income segregation also showed higher homicide rates. Mortality amenable to healthcare also varies significantly across cities. It turns out total amenable mortality varies more between than within countries, but preventable amenable mortality varies more within countries than between them. And a number of city factors are related to levels of preventable and amenable mortality as well. So I'm not going to get into all the details of this, but you can read it at your leisure. Now, everything I've talked about so far is about differences in life expectancy and mortality across cities, but we also see significant variations within cities, significant differences in life expectancy within our subcity units, and also associations with subcity socioeconomic characteristics. A number of findings for infant mortality, better living conditions, service provision, and public transportation in cities are associated with lower infant mortality, and cities where women are more empowered tend to have lower infant mortality rates as well. Greater political representation of women is linked to better infant and child survival in Brazil, and increases in air pollution are associated with increases in infant mortality over time. Births and births outcome, adolescent births, also significant between city variability. Higher homicide rates and larger population growth are associated with higher rates of adolescent births. Better sub-city living conditions and higher education are associated with lower rates. And low birth weight also varies. And there are some interesting associations. Lower maternal education was associated with higher prevalence of low birth weight. In contrast, higher sub-city education and better city social environment were associated with higher low birth weight, something that deserves further exploration. What are some gaps, opportunities with these, with the whole era of vital statistics? And here, this is just a starting point. We'll have a lot more discussions about this, but I just wanted to highlight a few areas. One is exploring smaller scale variations, and we have already started to do that using via several manuscript proposals that are underway. Longitudinal trends in mortality, and we'll talk more about this as we talk about the longitudinal data as well. There are proposals under development to look at factors associated with changes over time in mortality, life expectancy, and proportionate mortality. Of course, the health effects of heat and air pollution, there's work underway here too, which is some of it is quite advanced, and I've listed a few of the examples there, but more that we can do there. And last but not least, further explorations of inequities in mortalities. We have a paper underway on racial inequities in Brazil, but perhaps there are other opportunities to do additional work on inequities. So these are the four areas: smaller scale variations, longitudinal trends, health effects of heat and air pollution. Of course, this is very much related to the current priorities of the Wellcome Trust, and inequities in mortality. Let's talk a little bit about some of the survey results. A number of papers have explored the relationship of city factors to BMI, diabetes, and hypertension. In general, we found that higher city fragmentation is associated with lower BMI and obesity, but higher hypertension rates, although this disappears after we control for country, the hypertension association. This is something that we need to explore further. I'm not sure that we totally understand what's happening there. We found no association between city level travel time during peak traffic and individual odds of obesity and diabetes. The findings for subcities are a little more consistent. Higher population density is associated with lower rates of diabetes and less hypertension. Higher intersection density, which I learned today is Alex's favorite SALURBAL variable, is associated with higher BMI, higher obesity, higher diabetes, and higher hypertension. So there's some consistency here. Higher greenness is associated with lower BMI, obesity, and diabetes. So there's more work to do to dig into these results, potentially using L3 data, and we'll talk more about that. City factors on mental health and self-rated health. Longer commuting, this is one, I think this was our very first paper. Longer commuting and commuting by personal vehicle less access to transit are associated with more depressive symptoms. High physical disorder is related to worse self-rated health. This is only in 4 cities based on the CAF data. There's a lot more work in progress using the full SALURBAL data in this area. City factors on diet and alcohol use. I'm not going to read these. You can read this at your leisure, but I just wanted to show this because in reality, we have only explored this question in using data from Mexico. We have not really leveraged the full SALURBAL data for this yet, although there are papers underway, at least in the alcohol use realm. We've published a number of papers on inequities using the survey data, taking advantage of the individual level data in the surveys. So consistently for body mass index, obesity, and diabetes, lower education is associated with more diabetes and obesity among women, but the opposite is true among men, or the findings are a lot less consistent among men. And in fact, there's an effect modification by which the association becomes inverse or more pronounced inverse in men as city socioeconomic development increases. And both Monica and Ariela have published on this. Hypertension, this is a paper that was just approved by PNP but has not been published yet. Similarly, individual level education is associated with lower odds of hypertension in women but not in men. This paper did not explore the effect modification. This is something that perhaps might be interesting to do. I suspect it's going to be consistent given that BMI is a risk factor for hypertension. But we also found that living in sub-city areas with higher educational attainment was associated with higher odds of hypertension. So that's something to investigate a bit more what that means. There have been several papers that have been country-specific looking at inequities. One very important one is a paper that is in Press, American Journal of Epidemiology. This is, sorry, I forgot, most of them have the author, I forgot. This is Joanna's paper actually, showing that race differences in self-reported health in Brazil are stronger in cities that are more segregated. And then we have a paper in Argentina exploring this as well, something that I'm not going to talk about in detail, but there's I think there's more opportunity for inequities work with the surveys as well. City factors and changes over time in risk factor. Again, we have some country-specific work that I don't have time to get into the details, but we'll share these slides with you. So we see some interesting associations that link the food environment. It's actually changes in the food environment to the outcome measured later in time. So it's not a true change versus change analysis. And then we have a paper in Argentina that Santiago led looking at educational differences in trends over time. But this paper includes more than the SALURBAL cities. So work there, additional work possibilities for work on changes over time in inequities that we will be able to do with some of the longitudinal data that we're putting together that we'll talk later about. So some gaps opportunities for the survey. I think data, big picture descriptives of risk factor prevalence and associations with city, social environment, and built environment factors. I think there's more to do here. We can talk more about this at a later point. I've put down some ideas. There's an overall paper on harmonization with descriptives, which I know is in development. That will be an important paper to get out. Jessica has been working on a paper on child obesity. So we have some work going on with physical activity, depression, violence, and also perhaps building on some of the findings that I shared around diabetes, BMI, and hypertension, aligning, putting that together in context and seeing where it fits, where it doesn't fit, and trying to figure out what else we need to do to tell a compelling story about what we found there. Small area analyses, I believe there's a paper using the L3 data. I believe Santiago has a first paper proposal on this, looking at BMI. Big picture longitudinal trends in risk factors. We'll talk about this when we talk about the longitudinal data. I believe there is a paper proposed by Serena, I think, but there may be other opportunities there. And also thinking about next steps in inequities work with survey data. So let me move on to built environment. A major work in the built environment has been the creation of these typologies. The paper was recently published. And then more recent work that is not published yet, but linking these typologies to co-benefits, health and environmental co-benefits. So we have found that certain typologies, in particular cities with scattered pixels profile, low fragmentation of small isolated compact shaped patches, were more likely than other city profiles to have positive co-benefits, health and environmental co-benefits. And there were other profiles which were more likely to have negative co-benefits. So that's something to explore further, but I think it's an interesting use of the typologies and the SALURBAL data, looking simultaneously at health and environmental outcomes. And we've also reported that built environment features scale sublinearly. And so that means that they increase at a rate which is less than what you would expect based on the population size. This is also related to some of the scaling results that I talked about earlier regarding health outcomes, and it's an area I think also for future exploration. Air pollution and greenness. Nelson's paper, of course, reported significant proportions of the population exposed to high levels, and if we update this with the new standards, this is going to be significantly higher even. And also some interesting patterns by which certain city characteristics, including higher motorization, higher congestion, are associated with higher PM2.5, higher population density in contrast is associated with lower PM2.5, and also at the sub-city level, interesting associations with intersection density and green space in the direction that you would expect. So these are also interesting and policy relevant findings. A recent paper, which I think was presented at the last team meeting, documenting changes over time in greenness of cities and how it's associated with cities and sub-city characteristics. A number of papers on transportation and mobility, increased motorization across Latin America, and how certain urban form features are related to motorization. Policy approaches to reduce car traffic congestion, and what population groups tend to be more supportive of these policies. A description of the trips, and 1/3 of all trips in five Latin American cities were walking only. Socioeconomic patterning of cycling, and also some more detailed work in Bogota looking at associations of street characteristics and traffic stress with fatal and non-fatal collisions among cyclists and changes over time by gender in cycling. So what are some potential gaps, opportunities, priorities for built and physical environment? Again, this is just a starting point. I'm sure the Built Environment Corps has some thoughts on this. Longitudinal changes, I think, and longitudinal changes over time in urban form and correlates predictors of these changes. I believe we have one proposal, at least by Yuan Yuan, that focuses on that, taking advantage of the longitudinal data the Built Environment Corps has created. Factors associated with city level temperature features. We have the temperature data, of course, and this is something we've talked about that I'm not sure that we have any paper proposal yet. Also factors associated with small scale variations, digging deeper into the heterogeneities within cities. And we have some work in that area, but there may be more that can be done there. There's a lot of interest in these smaller spatial scale heterogeneity. Trends in air pollution over time and their correlates. That could be an interesting follow-up to Nelson's paper as well. And perhaps other ways of using the rich built environment data. Data reduction, machine learning. I think we have one paper that may be doing some of this. I think that Daniel and a colleague are involved in. I'm almost done. Other social, environment, and equity related. Of course, I'm not going to repeat here the inequity work that I already mentioned, but we have some data on park use and how it's associated with proximity to parks, and also the links between parks and perceptions of disorder. In Brazil, links between residential segregation and income inequality and poverty at the city level. Work in Peru led by Akram, looking at changes over time in access to safe drinking water and how that's patterned by city and social characteristics. And changes in Mexico in the food environment, also associated with urbanization and area deprivation. So some gaps, opportunities, priorities for the social environment. Perhaps longitudinal changes over time in social environment features and their association with other city characteristics, sort of a parallel to the built environment changes. We are still processing the longitudinal census data, but there might be potentially some interesting things there with just the descriptives of changes over time in city-built social environments. The links between social and built environment associations. So I don't know, how social environment features are related to city temperature, air pollution, urban form. I think this doesn't include the health outcomes, but I think we will have a database that will allow us to look longitudinally at how these things are related to each other. And I think that could be interesting as well. And also, perhaps going back, we've developed a number of social environment scores, also women's empowerment scores, and perhaps reviewing and updating the recommendations for the use of those scores in various other papers. So I think the next steps in sort of moving, thinking about how to move some of these priority areas forward is the executive committee will be discussing research gaps at our next meeting. We'll be looking at some of the priority papers that we identified in the past and identifying potentially new priority proposals and using the information from these summaries to also potentially inform some of that. We would also like the various groups like the vital statistics, the survey group, the built environment, and the social environment group to review these summaries that I did a whirlwind tour of, but to review them in a little more detail and think about, take a look at the priorities and propose, suggest things, etc. And then also to think about how the publications committee can also help us move forward work in priority areas, particularly as we prepare for SALURBAL 2. So I think, I'll stop here, and I hope I didn't take all the time and we have a little time for questions, but I think it has been a really useful exercise to put this together and to start to see parallelisms and also differences across various papers. Because it helps, as I was saying, to tell a story about what we find and what we have found and to identify some gaps and opportunities for what we need to do next as we prepare for the next phase of SALURBAL. It's been an enormous amount of work that everyone has done. It's amazing to look at those summaries and see all the work that's already happened and all the work that's already planned, because the manuscript proposals are already, also the pending proposals are already listed on those sheets, so you can get a full picture of everything that's going on. So I think I will stop there and open it up for questions or comments or reactions or anything you would like to share.
It's impressive.
And we have 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So if you have any thoughts, please feel free to unmute and ask your question.
I might comment because this is very impressive, and it's slow digestion, right? Like we really need to read it a lot and think about it. But I think it's incredibly interesting to put it all together this way. And we've discussed about, like writing it down and thinking it over and over, and it will make, I mean, the different findings like Anna presented here, like different papers contributing to one big idea in itself requires thinking about it a lot. So that's really nice how I remember her commenting on how birth weight increases in some scenarios and decreases in other scenarios. So it's interesting to think of why that might be and what further hypotheses might come out of these different findings. So it's so valuable to put all of this together. I just can't digest all of it yet, but I like it so much. It's really a great contribution, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to comment as well. I mean, it's the same impression. I mean, it's quite a lot of information. And I saw that in your last slide, Anna, that PNP are planning to perhaps organize some review of what we've produced so far in terms of having like a review of SALURBAL production, which I think it would be quite valuable in terms of organizing all this in a paper that summarizes all these papers basically.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, these summaries, when you look at them, I mean, they lend themselves to creating a sort of review paper of everything that's been found so far. So maybe that's something that we want to do.
Yeah. Oh, the other thing that came to my mind is that, I mean, as we have like 195 proposals so far, I mean, is there a way for us when we prepare or when you have an idea in terms of, you know, or to know if this, I mean, if that idea has already been, you know, proposed by someone else, or we have to run through the all 195 proposals by the titles and
yeah, I mean, I think, you know, right now the process is that you look through the, you know, the listing of the proposals that are on our website, right? But I think these, as we were putting together these summaries, I mean, these summaries can also be very helpful because then you can look in your area and see what's already been found, what's pending, what, you know, what can you add? Because I think we are at a point in the study where we have to be careful that we don't get distracted by doing work that is, you know, is important, but it may not be the priority because it's sort of at the edges, right? It's filling in gaps at the edges as opposed to focusing on the big questions that we still want to answer. And there may be room for both, but I think we need to think about priorities. So I mean, one of the things I was going to suggest that these summaries be available and that people can consult them as they are developing paper proposals too. I see some hands up. Let's see. I don't know what order they were in. Claire?
I think Manuel was first.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's impressive the amount of information that is being collected and will continue for sure for a year more. And I was thinking to, yeah, also, well, it would be nice to have all this information in a review paper, but also trying to think how this information can be in a link with something else that we can respond to the region, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, or talk to PAHO and see how this information can help or support countries in all these different areas. So as a policy brief or something that we can like all this information, how this fits in the Sustainable Development Goals or something else that is around that we can contribute to. So I just put this an idea to see if this is a good idea or feasible.
I don't know who's next. I see Valeska and Rodrigo.
I'm the next one. Well, thank you very much, Anna. Yesterday I was going back to all papers published, and it was very difficult to put all them together. But I couldn't, of course. But congratulations, you and everyone did a great job. Just giving it was because this is something that's very important. I think that from the PNP viewpoint, I'm not talking about them on behalf of them, but since I've been there, this is something very important. First of all, the 500 proposals that have been submitted, it would be nice to have at least the title of them in a easy way that we could at least think what people are thinking and see how more recently how they are to where they are going now in terms of hypotheses. The other thing is, I think Ramir said something, but it's a brief. I think a briefing, giving an overview of these results, it's very important, because this is something that I feel like a gap. When I want to explain about SALURBAL, and I say what SALURBAL is doing here in Brazil, and it's a little bit hard to, okay, so many things, that's what we say, but we don't, so it would be nice to give at least, just like an umbrella of main results, and perhaps for some countries, some, highlight some results. And I think a briefing would be nice. Thank you.
Rodrigo, I think you were next.
Hi. It's amazing job. It's quite impressive. I sort of agree with other people, but the one thing that puzzles to me is the idea that everything is written in English, and the region in which we're in speaks in Spanish and in Portuguese. So I wonder if there is any way in which, some of the results and findings, and the ones that are doing some sort of implementing some public policies, not necessarily speak English. So I wonder if it could be a good idea to have a more sort of practical tool or element just for policymakers and for the students of this region, because although I teach at the University of Chile in Chile, my students, most of them don't speak English, and they have no, I can perhaps give to them some stuff in English, but most of them don't. So I wonder if maybe could be a good idea to start a sort of dissemination scheme in which to train policymakers or to give some information regarding the stuff we are doing. People are doing in SALURBAL, and for students and policymakers. Thank you.
Yeah, so as Claire noted in the chat, so all the materials, the briefs that we produce, we do all of them in 3 languages. O sea, en general hemos intentado el material de diseminación que esté en los 3 idiomas. Las publicaciones científicas, bueno, depende dónde quiere publicar la gente, ¿no? Pero por supuesto que podríamos, we could definitely have papers in Spanish or in Portuguese published in Spanish or Portuguese journals, including this kind of review, if people think it would be helpful. So that is definitely something we can do. It's really, we need champions to help us do that, but we can definitely do it. Yeah, I think it's a good suggestion.
Yeah, I was recently part of a paper that was meant to be kind of a discussion of, actually Olga, I think, is also part of that series of papers that is meant to discuss methodologies to study disparities transnationally and how, various surveys and just very broad view. And the paper ultimately got translated to Spanish, so it's now available in both languages. It is a lot of work and it takes money, right? Like that, because it was, in that particular instance, it was professionally translated. Somebody was hired to do it. Yeah. I think that key pieces could be translated, maybe abstracts of papers could be translated by us, right? Because even if the full paper is in English or whatever the language of the journal, maybe at least abstracts could be in several languages, and that's much smaller ask.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I think that's something we should think about. Olga Lucia, I see you have.
Yeah, and maybe to complement what we did also on that special issue, maybe for Rodrigo, that could be something is like podcasts in Spanish that was useful for other audiences. So I think trying to have other modes of or ways of transmitting this information, maybe for policymakers, they're not going to read the paper. They like the reference in English, actually, but they like the policy briefs, they like the webinars in our languages, and they also like podcasts. So that could be another thing. And another thing, Anna, and you said that it's only, you only presented aim 1, but I think in the future, linking aim 1 with aim 2 and aim 3 will be a good idea, just to have the whole story. And I will add the capacity building that we have conducted in our regions, which is a great legacy from SALURBAL. So I think that's something that we probably will need to add in future presentations.
Yeah. Yes, we were thinking of doing these same kinds of summaries for all the aim 2 papers and the aim 3 papers, and presenting that at a future team meeting. Sarav, I see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi. Thanks, Anna, for the invitation to be at this meeting, and also for me to hear about the breadth of the work that is happening in SALURBAL. Congratulations to you and your team. I'm still recovering from the whirlwind tour of the summary you gave. The specific question I have is, as you know, one of the tasks we are doing at UNC in support of SALURBAL Heat is looking at the projected heat in the future years and how that may affect mortality in Latin America. I'm wondering if there is a different part of the scope in your project in SALURBAL overall to look at also the effects of emissions growth over the next few decades, and seeing how that may relate to air quality impacts as well down the road. So we focus on specific aspect of what is happening on the heat side, but again, the other aspect is, of course, changes in emissions, how those growth factors may affect future air pollution. Is there a component that you're all looking at?
I mean, we have some proxy emissions data, I believe, right, Daniel? No, don't we have some proxy cross-sectionally, but I believe, I may be wrong. In any case, yes, absolutely. I mean, this is a direction that we want to move in for the future of the project, the renewal of the project. So I think one of the goals over the next year or year and a half is to really develop research questions and associated data in this area. Absolutely. So I think hopefully we'll have a lot more conversations about this. So
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? I think one, I think it's really important for us as a study also, because as I said, in doing these summaries, I mean, we found, we had to go back to the papers to find out exactly what they had found, and, oh, this contradicts this paper, how can that be? So I think it's really important for us to look at those summaries carefully and think about them and think about, with a dose of healthy skepticism also, and think about what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what did we really find, right? And so I think, and that takes time to look at them. Of course, it's impossible to do it in this very short hour that we had, but I think I really encourage everyone to take a look at that, because I think it can really help us think about what we need to do to move forward, to generate results that are really important and impactful, right? Because we don't want to just do papers to do papers. We want to produce findings that are important for understanding or for action. And for that, we need to be able to integrate what we've done and learn from what we've done. It can't just be we put out these papers and there are these findings and they're all discordant and we don't understand why. No, we need to really grapple with what we found and where it makes sense and where it doesn't. So I don't know, that's what I felt after putting these summaries together, that it's something that was important for us to do as a team.
So I think we need to move into a break, but as the person that kind of oversees the implementation of our aim 4, which is the dissemination aim. I just want to remind everyone that we have 93 people on this call that are not responsible for communications and 1 person that is doing all of our communications. So just keep that in mind when you're making suggestions for an entire video series or a podcast. And it's great that everybody is so excited, and we really appreciate that. But I just wanted to make a note of that before we move ahead. Okay, so I think now we're going to take a break for about 10 minutes and then come back with a discussion of L3 data. So, and just a note that while we're on a break, I'm going to be putting up some advertisements of the working groups and cores. Since we're not doing small group meetings this time, I wanted to give them all a chance to let everybody know about what groups are active and how everyone can get involved. So I'll be playing that slideshow during the break and all the breaks during the meeting. So we will see everybody back in about 10 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I think we should get started with the next session, which is going to be focused on reflections on L3 small area analyses. And I think we are going to start with a short reminder of the L3 data that is available before the discussion starts.
Thank you, Claire, and welcome all. Yes, that's this is the plan for the next few minutes. So, Carrie, are you here?
Yep, I'm here. I'm ready.
Okay, great. So I will. Can everybody see the slides?
I can.
Okay, great.
Okay, so I just want to give an overview of the level 3 data that we do have before we go into the topic of talking about what we can do with it. So first, just an overview. So one of the aims in SALURBAL is to assess associations between the social, built, and natural environment neighborhood level exposures with health outcomes and risk factors. So we're using what we're calling level 3 units to operationalize neighborhoods. And so the DMC, we identified level 3 units for most of the countries, and we've created analytic data sets for cross-sectional analyses, looking at some area level ecologic analyses, health survey, and mortality. So here is just, next slide, Mariana. So here's just a brief summary, so you have it in the slides, of how we operationalize the level 2s. And in some cases, a level 2.5, where the level 3s, or sorry, level 3s, or level 2.5s in cases where the level 3s were really small and we needed an alternate definition. So I'm not going to go through all of this here. So next slide. So just one thing that we want to make sure is clear is that in all of the analytic data sets, we did include some inclusion and exclusion flags because we have some problems with some of the data in terms of the spatial accuracy and if they overlap with some of the built environment data that we use. So just to make sure that everybody's clear that if you use the data at level 3, our analytic data sets, you'll want to use these inclusion and exclusion flags to identify units that may need to be removed from analyses. So one of them is specifically for using the built environment measures, and the other one for analyses using built environment and census measures together. And before you do all of your analyses, and make sure you understand which flag to use, so please consult us at the DMC and we can help you before you get started and get too far into it. And then we're like, no, you have to redo it by removing all of these level 3s. So those are in the data sets. So next slide, Mariana. So just to overview what data we have available in the data sets. So the first one is the census data. So for almost all of the countries, we do have at least 1 year of census data for level 3s, plus population count data in either single years or age groups to evaluate the population and the sample size, or the size of some of the units. So next slide. And then for the built and natural environment, we have a number of measures that the built environment team has put together, including some urban form metrics with population density and distance to the city center, some green space metrics, blue space, hilliness in terms of elevation and slope, some street design metrics, and some newly derived parks metrics. And thanks to Josiah, we also now have some NO2 air pollution measures for level 3s. So next slide. So in preparation for some of the data sets, we created what we call this area level analytic file that's designed for ecologic, or what I'm calling area level cross-sectional analyses, using a target cross-sectional time point of 2011. So we have one data set per country with 1 row per level 3 or level 2.5 units. So it's designed so that we have level 3s nested in level 2s, nested in level 1 ADs. And in here we included all of the ID numbers that you would need for clustering and nesting, all of the census measures we have available available for level 3 is all the built environment measures, the inclusion and exclusion flags, along with a few key level 1 measures that could be used for adjustments or other things. So some socioeconomic scales, the climate zone, population growth, and we can include other measures in the future as people start using the data. So next slide. So for the health survey data, we have georeferenced health surveys for cross-sectional for Argentina, Chile, Colombia, where we have 2 surveys depending on what outcomes are available in each of those 2 surveys, and Mexico. And for child data, Colombia and Mexico, we have level 3s. So they're designed so we have 1 data set per survey, and then they're set up so there's 1 row per survey respondent. So we have persons nested in level 3s, nested in level 2s, nested in level 1 ADs. And again, these data sets contain all of the ID numbers that you would need for clustering, all of the harmonized survey measures that we have available for that country, all of the census, built environment measures, the inclusion exclusion flags, as well as some of these key level 1 measures that could be of use. So next slide. So for mortality, we have georeference data for 3 cities in Argentina. Brazil and Chile, we have the entire country, and we do have a potential L2.5 unit for Bogota in Colombia. So the data that we have at minimum contains the ID numbers for all of the nesting, demographics, age and gender, and a cause of death. So we've created some small area life expectancy estimates by sex for Caba and Cordoba. And we have Neuquén and 6 cities in Brazil currently in progress right now. So this could be linked to other data. And the next slide. So this is just kind of a summary of what data we have available in which countries. So just as kind of a summary of what's available in the different countries, we have at least some data available in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, and Panama. So this is just a nice matrix to see what type of data is available in which countries. And I think that was the last slide, right, Mariana? Okay.
That is correct. Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you. I appreciate it. Very nice summary, and lots of potential. Okay, so we'll continue now with the participation of 3 senior investigators, Fatima Pina, Alejandra Vives, and Tonatiuh Barrientos, who will think a little bit will share with us a little bit what are their thoughts about potential or most relevant L3 analysis. I think I will give them each 5 minutes to share with us some of their ideas. In preparation of this discussion, we encourage them to think along the lines that the categories that were presented before: mortality-related outcomes, area-level ecological analysis, survey-related. I think each of them will offer some reflections on them, but then we will, we will have an opportunity to discuss all together as a panel and hear from others too. So Fatima, I have your slide. You have prepared a few slides. Are you ready?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we'll go. So here, can you see them? Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot. So we had 5 minutes. So I am proposing five ideas. So the first would be this to analyze the risk of all-cause mortality associated with neighborhood area level socioeconomic status. And at L3, it's usually very small areas, and many times we don't have in our data any information about socioeconomic of the individuals, but we could use the socioeconomic status of the place of the L3 as a proxy for individual. And this has been shown in several studies that it's a good proxy. Usually people live in a neighborhood close to their own socioeconomic conditions. There are systematic reviews that show many studies in all of them are in high-income countries. No, there were no studies from Latin America showing that the risk of all-cause mortality is significantly higher for people living in low socioeconomic areas within the cities. So I think we could easily do this because we have this data already prepared, and we could make this analysis. It would be innovative because there is nothing about this in comparing Latin America cities. And in this systematic revision, they show that the association was stronger for men and younger age groups. We could also see this difference by gender and age group. Mariana, can you go to the second? This is also some studies that I've seen about population density and the association with mortality, all-cause mortality or specific causes mortality. Also, again, studies only in high-income countries, and they were showing the high population density was significantly associated with higher mortality. So I think we could look at this. So it's also data that we have available and we could look. Next. This is a study that I love and I'm longing to do this analysis also in SALURBAL. This study was done by Richard Mitchell in UK, and it's a very simple study. He has classified people, population in L3 level according to proximity to green areas. And he classified the population according to socioeconomic factors, which in our case could be, for instance, the socioeconomic of the L3, status of the L3, the place of residence, since we don't have socioeconomic variables for the individuals in the mortality data sets, but the place could be a proxy. And then what he saw is that we know that there is inequalities in mortality. The more poor have higher mortality rates than richer. But what they saw is that the closer they are to green areas, these inequalities are reduced. So you still have inequalities between richest and poorest, but much smaller. So the more they are close to a good environment of green areas, the more is reduced these inequalities. And he was not controlling for physical activity or whatever. It doesn't. We don't know if people are going to the green areas and practicing, because we don't have this type of data in the mortality data. But just being in an environmental with the green areas has helped to reduce the inequalities. So I think my start is about to end, but you can go to the last two. So, and these two, I put both together because I think there is lots of things we can do about the environmental, air pollution, and mortality, either by stroke, because there are many studies showing that there is an association between air pollution and mortality by stroke. We could examine that in small areas, also within cities, which would be very innovative. And also with cancer or respiratory disease, but in an intercity level. And other studies I didn't put here, but there is many studies now using the LUM, land use mix. So because there are studies that showing that the diversity of the environmental, it has a good impact in the health. So reduces some specific cause of mortality, and just seeing that you have a mixed land use in the neighborhood. So we could also do something like that. That were my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Fatima. Very interesting ideas, going in depth into some of the findings that we had from our prior work, and now leveraging the fact that we have this smaller scale, and also taking into account the interaction between city level factors and or buffering of some city level factors and outcomes. Wonderful. I'm going to stop my screen, and I think so. We have Ale Vives. Do you want to go next, Ale? And I think you.
Okay, yes. Okay.
You can go with the slides or without the slides. There's some echo.
Yeah, it's me. With slides. Okay. So hi everybody. I'm meant to talk about ideas for area level ecological analysis, but to be honest, we're probably all going to be tapping into ecological and individual level at the same time. So some of our ideas are gonna probably be repeating. But anyway, just I brought it more at the ideas more no tan aterrizadas, no? But on the one thing I wanted to reflect on is that L3 speaks about, on the one hand, level 2 heterogeneity. So we're looking at differences within L2 levels, which is what we're more used to looking at in SALURBAL. So that's one great thing. And the other thing it talks about is proximity. So it's what's going on near you, where you live, which is a lot more, and it talks a lot more about the place you live than L2. So that's where I start thinking about this. So to some extent, L3s are a proxy of neighborhoods. They're not the same because the neighborhoods are difficult to define in the territory. You ask people and they have different definitions of what their neighborhood is, but these L3s are great proxies of that. About the social environment, thinking about like ecological level, we like to think of it, we're working on a paper with Victoria Leon and Francisca Rosama and Mariana, and we like to think of it in two different levels. Like there's aggregated socioeconomic status at the neighborhood level. That's talking about your neighbors, who your neighbors are. And for instance, if your neighbors are all, if you are low-income person and your neighbors are all low-income person, that means more limited employment opportunities. And that has to do with family income, and that's going to be affecting child and adult health. That is something that we see in Latin America a lot, that we have the transgenerational poverty, like people having difficulty getting out of poverty because of where they live, which is really, really critical to health, right? So we have there like individual level outcomes, child and adult health, or more ecological estimates of life expectancy or mortality. On the other hand, there's government investment, like in your areas, in your territories, like what money is government spending and how that is going to interact with either the neighborhood level, aggregated socioeconomic status, or your family. Right, so what we think, it's not the same to be poor in a non-poor area versus in a poor area, or at least in your life trajectory. If you come from a very poor family, but there's good investment in your neighborhood, or you have at the same time non-poor neighbors, there's higher chances that you will get out of poverty and your children will have better health than you did. And we see that in Chile a lot. And that's the paper that we're working on. And then, of course, there's the opportunities to look at segregation and inequalities, and even maybe think of attributable risks. I don't know if that's a possibility with our data, but attributable risk linking territorial segregation, socioeconomic segregation at the city level, and risk now that we have geo-referenced cases. On the other hand, about built environment and ecological, of course, the built environment offers opportunities to improve health, green spaces, for instance, directly through your access to greenery, and indirectly through physical activity, but also the built environment through safety perceptions impacting health directly or indirectly through the fact that you're going to be using the green parks or the green areas or not, whether you feel they're safe or not. So that's going to have a lot of links to health, and also to the possibility of constructing community ties, social links, social support. And so that's going to be, so there's a lot of ways in which these built environment variables at the neighborhood residential level are going to be impacting health that I think we can address through proxy variables available already in our L3 data. And there's something we don't have, but it'd be nice to have, which is the location in relation to the city center, because that's going to speak about commuting times, employment opportunities, and opportunities for family income, which I think is nice. But that's just a general thought. And then there's climate change, neighborhoods, climate change, and health. And I see like three broad opportunities. There's one thing having to do with air pollution, and I know it's related to climate change, but I'm no expert there. And Fatima just talked about that. And then there's issues like the lack of greenery and heat islands, right? And heat islands are local, they are L3. So there's a lot to do with heat and mortality related to heat, birth outcomes, mental health, and other things that we can study. And then there's the social and built vulnerability to climate change, which I think we can delve into, which is very, very interesting. Issues. One issue here is the strong correlation between individual CES and L3 CES. So that's always something to think about. And also the correlation between individual socioeconomic status and the built environment in your neighborhood and green areas and heat islands. So it's all very strongly correlated. There's also differences in variability across L3s, like we are looking at data. In Chile, we have barely any variability across some socioeconomic indicators like sewage and piped water. So that's something to account for. Also very different L3 sizes. And thinking of like aggregated mortality data at the L3 level, in the Chilean case, we have very limited power for ecological level estimations. So that's another challenge. So that's very general thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ale. Great reflections. And just a couple of notes. We do have the distance to the city center, you know, of this
didn't see it.
Yeah,
great.
So that's
that's nice. Nice to know.
All right. So last but not least, Tonatiuh Barrientos. Tona.
Thank you, Mariana.
The floor is yours.
Thanks. No slides on my side. So I thought that perhaps the first and most important thing was to highlight the evident. And the evidence is that if you take a look at the slides that Carrie showed, and she also has like another set of slides that are much more precise on what type of data is available for and harmonized for surveys across SALURBAL, you will see that there are a lot of very clear opportunities analyzing data on obesity and diabetes and hypertension, that are very highly prevalent in our countries. And I think that there's still a lot of questions that we can ask with that information. And then there's also another group of outcomes that I think that are very important and we have maybe not looked into it as much. And those are the ones related to mental health. And there's also harmonized information for tobacco consumption and alcohol. So I think that there's also, like a complete different set of questions that could be asked just using that information that is readily available and harmonized. And I think that Anna already pointed, to what are some of the key and most pressing topics. But I would really encourage you to think about questions that are going to be important for local governments and things that are amenable of intervention and that we could actually help create, change. Then after that very general statement, I would go into more precise things. So one of the things that I saw that was very interesting to me is that we have, very unique data and information on reproductive health that could be used, more extensively. And let me just give you an example. We know that there's a lot of incident cases of diabetes and hypertension during pregnancy. And that is something that we rarely analyze because they tend to be rare. So, because, we only have such a small number of cases, on each of the surveys. But since we have now information for several countries, there may be an opportunity to start exploring what's going on with gestational diabetes and hypertension. And how does that relate, with some of these urban variables that we also have at level 3. So I think there may be something really nice there for an outcome that we rarely study. There's also information on whether women had been getting, Pap tests and mammograms. And I really encourage people to think about that because precisely those are the types of activities that we know are going to be very good to prevent some types of cancer. So I think it may be very interesting to look into that, to check, even just look into disparities may be very interesting, but also if we can start thinking about how the city favors or makes it difficult for women to get to the health system, that could also be very good and very informative. I also think that there's a lot, of questions related to gender and the intersection between the city and gender that are still lingering that we should pay attention to. I know that because this has come up, in several of the conversations that we have had. No? So it is very important for us to understand, for instance, why is it that women in more or less urbanized conditions are increasing their prevalence of obesity? And how is it that prevalence is related to, for instance, the availability of parks and greenness? But we know that there's a very strong effect modifier, which is violence and the perception of violence. So I think that if we pull all of the data that we have together at L3, we may be able to actually start providing some very good answers of what's going on between the intersection of women and how is it that women have a more difficult or an easier way to take advantage of some of the city characteristics. And then finally, I remember some of the studies that were done in discrimination, particularly racial discrimination in the US some time ago. And I thought that that's very interesting because now that we have information at L2 and L3, we could start asking questions about what happens to people that have, like specific individual characteristics, but that are living in a different context, right? Like for instance, what happens if you are very poor and you're living in a not so poor neighborhood compared to being very poor and still be living in a poor neighborhood. So that kind of question can be very interesting because it's giving you the contextual effect and not only the individual effect. And I think that kind of reasoning can be brought into separate and different questions. And then we will also have the opportunity now to check the associations with L3, but also with L2. So, and that may be also very, very interesting. And I'm gonna stop there, Mariana, because I already.
Thank you very much,
Thanks.
Donna. Wonderful, and thank you all. So we have now a few minutes for questions. Anna, you have your, I see your, I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. No, thank you for this panel. I think it's interesting hearing the different perspectives and critically mentioning some questions that we need to still move on. I will 100% agree with Tona what he said, because it's part of our interest on gender and some of the perinatal issues. But I also think in terms of L3 data, that one thing, at least I have been hearing, and I think it's interesting to also try to systematize and explore, it's trying to determine informality in the cities, in the sense of how we define informal settlements, how we define them at L3. I think we have so far characterized a poor, urban poor, poverty, but very specifically just using, census data and defining overcrowding and probably some other indicators that are more frequent associated with the definition of informality, but having a gradient of how urban poorness it's distributing in a city, I think it's interesting. And I think it will be also relevant for climate change, probably.
Thank you, Anna. Other comments or questions?
Mariana, I think, building on what we were talking about earlier, I think it's, for example, for diabetes, hypertension, and BMI and obesity, major risk factors in the region for many diseases. We've looked at predictors at the L2 and L1AD level, and we found some things which make sense, some things that we were a little surprised by, some inconsistencies. And so I think there could be an opportunity to really look at those findings and decide and see how using the L3 data can help us shed light on what's really going on. And that is really very directly policy relevant, because if we want to make some recommendations to policymakers about, cities should be greener, cities should be, they should be more walkable, I'm not sure that we can make those on the basis of the analysis. Some yes, but there's some discordances. So how can we hone in to get a better answer to the question of how policy relevant built and social environment features affect levels of these risk factors? So that's a perfect, I think, opportunity to really use the L3 data linked to the survey data that we have.
Yeah, no, great point, Anna. And I mean, along those lines, I was thinking that a lot of what we know about the role of neighborhoods and health outcomes comes from other regions too, no? And it may be that, and some of these unexpected findings, it may be that in the region, things are just different, and the cities are shaping in different manners that don't behave or we're not really identifying the key factors, city level factors, no, and neighborhood level factors that are important. Daniel, you have Daniel and Olga.
Yes, I wanted to echo Anna's point about informality. And I mean, one challenge for all of us is to think beyond the binary of formal versus informal. And I think Anna's point was a very good one, how to characterize kind of the different levels of pseudo formality. It's shifting rapidly. These neighborhoods are settling, and the first thing that happens is they get a power meter from the power company because it's private before they have an address. So they're already in their path to formality. They're planning, they leave streets open because they hope that the government will pave them 5-10 years from now. And those types of kind of differences of different gradients of formality, I think, are important and present in many different ways, right? Not only in terms of how they where and how they live, but also employment, mobility, water and food, sort of nutrition, and even health services.
Great. Yeah. Olga, Lucia?
Yeah, I wanted to comment one on informality and another component that I think we should also address. So the first one, I agree with Daniel that the term is not informality. Actually, probably there are self-built settlements that they were informal at some point, Now they still are very poor, but they're still developing. So something within the framework or within the region of Latin America that highlights that component, it's going to be very important. I think it's 25% of our population in the region that lives there. So I think that's one point. I don't know what is the variable. Maybe the new data set that you found, Ana, on Techo could help us a little bit, but we probably will need to, at least from some cities. I don't think we can have it from all, have some of those indicators. So that was one comment on self-built settlements. And the other thing that we could also think about are thresholds. Like so far, many of our analysis have been like some of these linear associations. Few of them we have explored thresholds with, I think it was Josiah who did some splines, or it was someone from your group, Daniel. But I think adding this element of thresholds that may help us explain why, for instance, intersection density is associated with higher BMI. Or also having a lot of more discussion of if it's because it's more high intersection, more informal food on the streets in a region, something like that could help us. So I think the other component will be thinking about potential thresholds in our databases.
Thank you, Olga Lucia. And I think perhaps thinking in the future of constructing some profile with different variables and like profiles of this informality or something to characterize the neighborhoods might be something to consider. Valeska. We cannot hear you.
Who is speaking? Me? Oh, sorry. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I was putting my earphone. Okay, I think that is it's a great opportunity to look inside the cities, looking at the L3s in cross-sectional way, because we've seen here in Belo Horizonte some very contradictory and paradoxical things relate to the transitional epidemiology in terms of nutritional epidemiology, the demographics and everything. What I mean, inside within a city, we can see different transitions, epidemiological transitions in terms of the all those information that we have in terms of the BMI, the diabetes and hypertension and things like that. And one thing that we found here in Brazil, and it's in the paper, the Deborah's paper, is that exactly what we're not expecting about the hypertension. So we found a very different, a positive way that we're expecting in terms of hypothesis, in terms of this socioeconomic association and hypertension. And we did find the reverse way. So I think that this is something that we must understand better. And for that, I think that it's an opportunity to look at some health utilization, healthcare, because I think that it's very important to understand why this is happening, certain, transitional, very different transition, specifically thinking regionally speaking. So I think that this is a very interesting possibility, even sectionality. The other thing is to look at within the same area, the same location, the overlapping of either risk factors or outcomes, and trying to see the city, what is happening in that area in terms of risk factors together, jointly risk factors, and together jointly in terms of outcomes, because this is what happens. In fact, we have everything together at the same time in the same place, and perhaps to simulate in terms of understanding what happened in that area, small area, in terms of either risk factors or outcome. And I definitely agree with the discussion about the boundaries and what we we have to think about what's formal, informal, legal, illegal, all these things. And I agree with Olga and Daniel that it's nice, it would be nice to think about a nice framework for that, specifically for Latin America.
Wonderful. Yes, Tona?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think that there's also an opportunity because as far as I remember, we have the data. Maybe Carrie will correct me, but we have now, for instance, information that has been harmonized for hypertension in terms of diagnosed hypertension and also blood pressure measurements. And doing that analysis, comparing one outcome against the other, may be very interesting on itself, because we do know that the rates of diagnosis are different by socioeconomic levels. So that may help, also shed some light as to why are we seeing some of these associations.
Great. Okay, I think unless there's any burning question, I think we have to stop now. I want to thank everybody for all your sharing your thoughts and insights. I think this was a very nice follow-up of our initial discussion about the gaps and going more in depth into the uses of the L3 data. And I think all of us that, in working groups, we should just go back to what we have been discussing in these two sessions and think about, more concrete plans for moving forward. No? Thank you all very much, presenters and participants, and everybody for your attention, and continue enjoying the rest of the meeting.
Thank you, Mariana. Okay, so now we have another break. So please come back in 7 minutes and we will hear 3 works in progress presentations. Hello, everyone. So we will get started now with the next session because we have a lot to get through in 1 hour. So I will pass it over to the moderator of the session, Olga Lucia.
Gracias, Clary. Hola a todos. Qué alegría verlos, aunque sea virtual. Ojalá que nos podamos ver en persona el próximo año, pero me da mucha alegría estar otra vez en el annual meeting de SALURBAL. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the work in progress presentation. We're going to have 3 presentations. Just a remind that our presenters have 12 minutes each, and we'll have 8 minutes for question and answers for each presentation. So we will start with Anne Dorothy Slovic, coming from Sao Paulo. Go ahead, Anne.
Thank you, Lucia. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can you all see it?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to give you an update in work in progress. Here I'm going to talk about self-reported climate change hazards in Latin American cities and how we understand the role of potential role of the social and built environment and barriers to action. Quick note, we decided to change the title based on some previous recommendation when we presented to the climate change working group with Katie Invade, who's also my co-lead on the project. Just wanted to mention some very important people that have contributed to this work, that are Karen Knoll, Josia Keffert at Drexel University, but also Lucas Soriano and Nelson Gouveia here at the Hub São Paulo. So, what are we working on? We're working with surveys. That's our main core data set, right? And this survey comes from CDP. So let me just give you a quick parenthesis for those that have no idea what CDP. CDP is actually the former Carbon Disclosure Project, and it's an international nonprofit organization that works on coordinating efforts on global carbon emission disclosure system for cities, but also for the private sector. And every year, a CDP has an annual survey that they send to city officials. And the goal of the survey is actually to track climate change impacts and adaptation and mitigation actions. At the end, when we receive the result of these surveys, we do a scoring of cities, and also they do the same thing for companies, and they are able to keep track and highlight the progress of the cities and all the climate actions. So in our case here, we worked with the 2019 survey, and that year, the survey had 14 different components, and the survey can change from every year we can ask different questions, but that year, we looked at these different 14 components, and we were looking at what was most completed. And it came down to climate hazard and vulnerability, and also adaptation. And so it's what I'm going to present to you now. So we wanted here to leverage the self-reported reported CDP data and see how we can characterize climate vulnerability in action across SALURBAL cities. And as I mentioned, with the changing titles, we also wanted to explore the role of the social and environmental factors and see the potential predictors of climate vulnerability in action. As methods, and we understand that this is a paper that's a first paper, and there is potential to explore more of this data. So we run a frequency analysis for hazards, adaptation actions, and barriers. And then we integrated our social and building environmental factors, variables, using a univariate regression model. So this is our sample. After doing the matching between the CDP cities and the SALURBAL cities, it came down to 127 cities. We have 124 L2s and 3 L1s, mostly in Peru. As you can see, you have here the map of where with our samples, the cities studied. And also we broke down the cities by population percentiles. And so in small, medium, and large, and with 42 small ones, 43 medium, and 42 large cities. So we're back to our hazards. Cities had to respond. We had to list what was the most significant climate hazard faced by our city. When we did the cleaning and we did our selection, we considered the city that have responded, yes, this is a significant hazard. And what happened is we had this huge list of different reported hazards, right? Remember, we were looking at reported data responded by city officials. And when we run the frequency of all these hazards, we looked at the most reported one. And then we realized that some of these hazards has similarity and they could be grouped. So we came down to 6 top hazards: storm, extreme temperatures, flood, water scarcity, wildfire, and landslide. And then we ran the frequency based on the group hazards. So these are the results that are mapped here. So that's the frequency of the most significant hazards for our city groupings. And just by looking at the maps, I just want to point out quickly to a few things. The first one are the concentrated reported hazard on coastal areas. And also I wanted to stress one point is that out of all these cities, like Brazilian cities are the ones that have responded the most. So that's also explain strong presences of the significance also in these regions. Another thing that I believe being relevant here is to show how there is a multiple and overlapping of some of these hazards. On the other hand, you also have low reported hazards. For instance, almost no cities have responded or reported storms in Chile. Same thing for landslide in Argentina, and same thing for wildfire in Argentina and Peru. Now, next question that we looked at was the adaptation action, and we included GDP. So, for instance, the question they were asked is to describe the main actions that we were taking to reduce the risk, vulnerability, and all the different adaptation actions we were taking. And here we matched this by percentage, and we included GDP. And for the GDP, we did the same thing we did the population. We included GDP terstile. So here you have our grouping by small level, medium, and large GDP levels. And what we see here when we look at the percentage of reported actions, adaptation actions, that we see that the most reported ones have to do with green space, hazard mapping, education awareness. Now, when we look at the least reported one and consider all GDP levels, we see that nature-based solution was the least reported. And I would like to point out to the fact that no temperature management reported by low GDP cities. Now, there is another component that I think is worth exploring while we're moving into writing our discussions, is also the limited actions related to urban planning, air quality, water, and flood management. Now let's look at the challenges. Here, same thing that we did for the hazards. We had an extensive list of different challenges. So we ended grouping them by similarity and frequency. And what we see here, that's the most reported challenges have to do with urban environment. And when we look at the socioeconomic aspects of it, so things like services, living conditions, governance, economics, these are like also most reported ones. And I also would like to include the financial and resource availability. Now, thinking about least reported challenges, public health, safety, security, migration, and data. So finally, we run our univariate model. And here I would like to stress that we were not able to include our L1AD or ME. So what are these results telling us? And when we looked at the different variables, so greenness, density, city fragmentation, per capita CO2, and PM0.5. So then what we have here is that if we're looking, for instance, per capita CO2 or PM2.5, we know that the alteration of living in the cities with higher CO2 and PM2.5 are also associated in our case here with the likeliness of reporting flood as hazard. Now, we also have reporting lower likeliness to lower floods as hazard. Now, on the opposite, if you look at greenness, and if you look at population density, then if we look at flood and wildfire and landslide, we have the opposite here, like living in areas with, let's say, greater wildfire is associated also with higher odds. Living with cities with greater greenness is associated with odds of wildfire, and this same thing for population density and floods. And now looking at the social environmental factors, the one where we find most associations, potential associations, was with population size. And also just to point out here, we also looked at when the city had reported more than 2 hazards, okay? So here we have the odd ratios and likeness with temperature, with water scarcity and landslides, and also with cities that have reported more than 2 hazards. Now, we wanted to bring here some pointers for discussion, right? We understand that this data works with self-reported hazards, but we strongly believe that it can help us understand city characteristics that might predict how vulnerability is perceived. It could help, we were talking in the previous meeting here that we're talking about identifying priorities and risk and influence public policy, and I think that could be very beneficial for that. We also saw that variation in reported action might provide insight regarding regional disparities, and we saw apparent and strong and common action regarding mapping and modeling efforts. Now, there are things that we should look at, like such as urban areas with lowest GDP report, a few adaptation actions related to water management, temperature management, air quality, and nature-based solutions, despite having identified hazards that are related to these efforts. And that's, we see that when we looked at a reported hazard with like such a flooding, heat, and we see that there are relatively few adaptation action reported in response. Another point is that urban planning is rarely reported, and that might indicate a lack of strategic and long-term planning for adaptation. Governance is reported as a challenge, but not as an adaptation action category. So just to end here, to talk about next steps, our plan is to submit in the January round to the PAP. We would like then to submit to the journal in February. And we put here 3 journals that we have in mind, and we're open to suggestions. And the next step also to work with this data will be also to look in another proposal, another manuscript at perceived versus observed hazards. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to your comments and suggestions.
Thank you, Anne. Very nice presentation. So now we have some times for questions. So who wants to make a comment or a question? Andrea, was that a clap or a hand up? Andrea.
It was a clap.
Okay, good. Thank you, Andrea. So any questions and suggestions for Anne? I actually had a question. When you
Ana?
said, hi, go ahead, Valesca.
Sorry, I was
No.
trying to find my reaction here. It's always confusing. Thank you, Anna. Very nice presentation. Thank you. Thank the team for put this together. It's a hard work when we work with someone's data, so it's nice. My question is, have you thought about any variable or possibility in terms of governance or something related to those cities or sub-cities that could have some specific marker for governance or anything like that? Because I think that I was looking at these slides, and it's interesting because this is very much related with specifically in Brazil with Islams, because they usually are in the mountains. I mean, not in Brazil, but in Latin America, and these lies usually happen in the floods and when it's rained too much. So, and this is related to some political will to change the urban form, or So, have you developed something about that?
Thanks for the question, Valesca. And also anyone in your team here, feel free to jump in if you want to complement my answer. I think it's a really interesting question, Valesca. And to be honest with you, I think we realized that potential within the last 3-4 weeks, because when we were looking at all the results and we started writing, we started realizing this difference between what was the action and the challenges, and we tried to link them. And then we realized that, yes, there is this discrepancy between governance. So we're definitely going to bring back to the group, and we're going to talk about it and see how we could improve it or not, because the goal of this paper are the characteristics, right? But I think it's a great suggestion, and we'll talk more about it. Thank you.
Perhaps just to complement that, at a certain point, you should talk with the governance group and see how we can manage that in terms of improve some markers or whatever.
Ali?
Yeah, hi. No, just thinking of the results of the associations between hazards and concerns, and thinking about how they might be very strongly geographically linked, like geographical conditions that imply a higher risk and a higher concern. So just that about the geographic component here, which is, I think, critical and probably more difficult to address in aiming to find predictors or signs, predictors of vulnerability, right, or concern. The geographic confounder, I think, might be present or is present.
No, absolutely, Alejandra. And I strongly believe that's also one of the ideas of the next paper, to look at the observed versus the perceivable versus observed hazards. And there will be certainly a space to include more and more of such important variables that are related to climate hazards and actions, for sure.
Yeah, and I mean geography in the sense that hazards and risks coexist, maybe for geographical reasonable reasons, or maybe like in Chile, we have mountains and mining activity together. And so you have the coexistence of pollution or perceived high pollution and risk of floods because of because of the geography, or cuencas, the rios, that rivers that might flood, and in places that geographically concentrate a lot of air pollution. So these kind of issues, I think the coexistence might be interesting to look at, the coexistence of hazards and risks, and understand how they are linked.
For sure, that's great.
Thank you, Ale. Now, last question, Anna.
Yeah, thanks. I think it would be really interesting. I don't know if part of this paper, maybe a future paper, but to link this data to actual objective measures of hazards. I think you were saying that, Anne, earlier. So for example, Josiah, that you're the flood data, the flood hazard data, to look at to what extent the city being in an area that has been characterized as having a flood hazard, does that lead to a reporting of that? And if not, what factors are related to greater concordance between reality and reports? Now, given, these reports are kind of iffy, as sometimes we don't really know who's reporting, but in any case, something like that, I think could be very impactful if we show, for example, that things are underreported, that there's lack of awareness, potentially, and, maybe in smaller cities or something about cities that is related to lack of awareness of these hazards.
Sure, no, absolutely, Anna. We will look into it. Thank you.
And thank you so much for your presentation. Now we have our second presenter, who is Nancy Lopez. Go ahead, Nancy.
Thank you, Lucia. I'm going to share my screen so you can see.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the opportunity to present this study titled Greenhouse Gas Emissions associated with the Mexican diet, identifying social groups with the largest carbon footprint. And I have to say this is an original idea from Brent, who kindly invited me and the colleagues you can see here to develop this study. Okay. And according to the last estimation, food systems are responsible for 1/3 of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. And in this figure, we can see that the contribution of food systems to these emissions come from 4 sectors that you can observe here in this circle, that are land-based, energy, industry, and waste, which in turn include categories from the life cycle stages of food, that is from production to end of life in this circle. And for each one of these categories, we can observe individual emissions sources. Therefore, diverse sources are contributing to the food system emissions. There is also diversity in the contribution of food systems to the greenhouse gas emissions by country. And this map shows that food systems are responsible for 40% or more of greenhouse gas emissions in several countries in the global south. And they reflect that even though countries in the global north, such as USA, China, and the European Union are the main contributors of greenhouse gas emissions, the contribution of food systems to these emissions are significant in the global south. Therefore, it is important to analyze. However, estimated greenhouse gas emissions by country may not be enough to understand better which factors have environmental impact within countries and inform policies addressing the sustainable development goals. And if one of the intervention is to promote climate-friendly diets, we also need to consider that foods vary considerably in their environmental impact, and therefore also depends on the dietary patterns within a population. And in this graph, we can observe that on average, producing 1 kilogram of beef results in about 2.5 times more emissions than the same amount of cheese, 3 times more than pork, 4 times more than chicken, and around 50 times or more than fruits and vegetables. And several studies have evaluated the environmental impact of diets. However, the vast majority of studies have been conducted in countries in the global north, and evaluating the environmental impact of diets in countries in the global south, including Latin America, is also important, since the majority of the world population lives in this region, and many of these countries are in the midst of a nutrition transition that could have significant impact on future greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, the aims of this study were 3. The first one was to estimate total dietary greenhouse gas emissions in Mexico. The second one was to examine the contribution of major food and beverages to total dietary emissions, and to assess the variation in dietary greenhouse gas emissions across social groups. For addressing these aims, we used 2 primary data sources. The first source was dietary intake using the 7-day food frequency questionnaire from the 2018 National Health and Nutrition Survey that collected dietary information from adolescents and adults. And generally, participants report frequencies of consumption for 163 items in the groups you can observe here, but and we also analyzed these food groups with the exceptions of animal origin foods due to the large difference in greenhouse gas emissions between beef and other meat products. And we calculated the consumption in kilograms of each item per person per day. To estimate greenhouse gas emissions, we use the SHARP indicators database, which was developed to quantify the environmental impact of diets in 4 European countries and contains estimates for 182 primary products. And the values are reported in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of food as eaten. And as I just want to say that this measure consider the diversity of greenhouse gases. And the estimations include impacts from packaging, transport, and home preparation. To determine dietary greenhouse gas emissions, we link each item in the food frequency questionnaire to the most appropriate item in the SHARP ID database. And in total, we match 157 items, and the values for the remaining items were obtained from other sources. We estimated means of dietary greenhouse gas emissions and total energy intake in the overall sample by food group and by socio-demographic characteristics you can observe here. And we also estimated greenhouse gas emissions per 1,000 kilocalories to capture differences in greenhouse gas emissions net of differences in energy intake. Also in the overall sample and by socio-demographic characteristics, but given the time, I'm going to present only the results in the overall sample for greenhouse gas emissions by food group and by socioeconomic status. And this indicator is similar to what we use in SALURBAL. That is an index constructed using household characteristics and assets, and was classified in low, medium, and high using tertiles of the distribution of the index. So what we found in this table, this table shows dietary greenhouse gas emissions and energy intake per day. And first we found that overall diets of Mexican adolescents and adults produce a mean total greenhouse gas emissions of 3.9 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per capita per day. And you can observe the food groups ordered by their contribution to total energy intake. And we can observe, as expected, that tortillas is still the main contributor to total energy intake, but you can observe the contribution to emissions is relatively low. The largest contributor to dietary greenhouse gas emission was beef, which was responsible for almost 15% of the total dietary greenhouse gas emissions. In contrast, beef contributed to only 2% of daily calories. Other large contributors to greenhouse gas emissions were corn products, 12%, dairy, 11%, drinks, 10.5%, soft creams and pastas, almost 9%, and chicken annexed with 8.5%. In this slide, you can observe first the total dietary greenhouse gas emissions by socioeconomic status, and you can observe the emissions were higher among groups in the higher socioeconomic status. And this figure shows that the relative contribution of emissions associated with each food and beverage group to total dietary greenhouse gas emissions, also stratified by socioeconomic status. And the figure shows that as a proportion of total greenhouse gas emissions, beef, that you can observe here in green, makes a relatively larger contribution of dietary greenhouse gas emission among those with high rather than medium and low socioeconomic status. The contribution in high socioeconomic status was 18%, in the medium was 14%, and in the low socioeconomic status, 11%. Fast food in yellow was also responsible for a higher proportion of emissions among the high socioeconomic status than the low, whereas corn-based products here in this green color contribute more to the low stratum than the medium and high. The contribution in the low socioeconomic status was 16%, the medium 12%, and the high strata 10%. So one of the key findings of this study was that the total dietary greenhouse gas emission in Mexican adolescents and adults was 3.9 kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent And we put this into perspective, we can observe that it's lower than that has been estimated in Brazilian adults based on the Argentinian diet and also in US adults. And one of the potential reasons of these results is that a Mexican diet is comprised of lower beef consumption, as even though it's the main contributor, the consumption is lower in Mexico than Brazil and Argentina. And we need to remember also that beef production and consumption in general play an important role in Argentina and Brazil than in Mexico. And in Mexico, corn-based products, which are comparatively lower in greenhouse gas emissions, are still a dietary staple. Another key finding was that the total dietary greenhouse gas emission was higher among people with higher versus lower socioeconomic status, which can be explained because more advantaged groups consume a greater number of calories and eat diets with a higher carbon footprint per calorie. And the only other study of total dietary greenhouse gas emission by socioeconomic status in Latin America region was conducted in Brazil, where the authors found opposite results. Here, dietary emissions were higher in the lowest versus the highest educational stratum. And potential explanation of these differences between Mexico and Brazil could be because of social differences in social patterns in beef consumption, and also differences in the affordability of beef, which is influenced by both beef prices and the income distribution in each country. The study has limitation, and the most important is that we use a database intent to calculate the carbon footprint of diets in European countries. And although the food system is largely global nowadays, there are certainly differences in production practices, transportation patterns, and food preparation methods between Europe and Mexico. Therefore, our estimations almost certainly have some unknown degree of error at the individual level. However, we consider reasonable to use this database because it will be an enormous effort to estimate country level or even within country regional values for each of the items. And we consider this study as a first approach using available data to estimate dietary greenhouse gas emissions among a large, highly populated country in the global south, including patterns by a social group. And the take-home message is that our findings highlight the need to reinforce dietary recommendations that are healthy and sustainable, as well as to consider potential differences across countries and social groups. And just to finish, I want to say that this manuscript or study was already submitted to journal, and is under review. Thank you. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Gracias, Nancy. Very nice and innovative. Do we have any questions for Nancy? I actually have a question. It's more, probably you have it under discussion. You have studied obesity. Now we're studying greenhouse gas emissions, and they don't seem to be correlated, right? I mean, like, and so we are recommending healthy and sustainable, but it seems that by SES, they are different, right? Or am I interpreting this wrong?
Yeah,
and that what
right.
will be the message there? Yeah.
Yeah, well, we'll see, the contribution. Yeah, you're right. It seems that all the results or the studies have found that the obesity is now higher in lower socioeconomic strata, right? The stratum. And yeah, it's an important thing. And the problem, for example, is that here in these results is not too easy to see, but for example, foods that are very high or high content of that have high content of sugar, usually they don't their emissions are lower. So yeah, it seems contradictory, and we need to think more about how to balance the recommendations for the population health and the planetary health.
Exactly. Yeah, the component of healthy and sustainable need to be within actually the cultural component of food in our countries. But this is really nice. Nancy, Nelson, you have a question.
Yeah, no, it's just not a question, it's just a comment that, I mean, this is very interesting and important work. And just to highlight this, I mean, we are under COP, and this is actually the same subject is being discussed quite a lot on this past week and this week on the COP 26. So I think the importance of this work is highlighted by what's happening exactly right now and the climate change discussion. So yeah, just to highlight that.
Thank you. Thank you, Nelson.
Thank you, Nelson. Leticia?
Hi, Nelson team. Congratulations for this innovative work, especially for the region. One thing, I don't know if I asked it before, but did you thought in classify the items according to process, unprocessed, ultra processed, to see if there's something, because there is a lot of discussion besides beef and meats, the ultra processed can be very important in the emissions. So
yeah, we have not done this analysis, but it could be interesting, and Brent can say more about it. But the thing is that I think the most important part of the emission is by the production more than the processing, it seems. So this is the reason why we not see, for example, beverages or processed foods with higher emissions in comparison, for example, as I showed the beef that is the main contributor. But yeah, you're right. It could be interesting to see, because as mentioned, we want to balance the planet, the health from population and from the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Leticia. Mariana?
Yes, hi. Congrats, Nance and team. A very interesting study. I believe an important next step for this literature is to estimate dietary greenhouse gas according to the type of food production. For example, a fruit or a beef produced from agroecology, farming family is very different from a fruit or a beef produced from agribusiness, from commodities. I don't know the data sets that you guys used, but if there is this kind of data available, this could be a very interesting next step, because it informs more for policy, for practice, and for the need of change that we need now in the food system. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. Thank you for your comment, and I agree. It is very important, and I think this is relatively new. This topic is underdeveloped, and it's something that, as I said, we need in our region as estimations, right? Probably will not change a lot, but yeah, there are specific things that we need to consider to a better approach. And as you said, this is the idea is to inform policies. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, Nancy. Do we have another question? We have a couple of minutes for Nancy. I actually have a question, Nancy. What about gender? Are women more likely, less likely, based on their consumption? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, this is very interesting. I couldn't show all the results, but we also analyzed by educational attainment and also by urbanicity. And in general, the more disadvantaged groups have a more climate-friendly diets. And in the case of by sex, it's interesting because if we did not consider the calories, it seems male produce more greenhouse gas emissions, but when we control by calories, it's higher among women. so yeah, I don't remember right now the results, specifically the results by food group, by gender, but yeah, it's something very interesting that we also found.
Thank you, Nancy. We hope can expand your work to other countries. This is very nice.
Totally. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going now to our last presentation, which is from Joanna Miguez and Neri Guimares. Did I pronounce that well? Sorry. Joanna, go ahead.
Thank you, Olga. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
And we can also see your presentation.
Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Joanna. I'm happy to be here, and I will present our work on travel time and dietary intake in Latin American cities. We have just finished the analysis of this manuscript, and we'll start to write the discussion. The rationale for this proposal is that more time spent traveling can translate into less time for buying food and cooking at home, leading to a greater consumption of lower time cost meals and ultra-processed foods. However, there is limited empirical evidence on how travel time affects diet, and even less is known about this in Latin American cities. So our research question is travel time at the city level associated with individual dietary intake? And we hypothesize that longer travel times are associated with poorer dietary intake, as indicated by a lower consumption of vegetables and a higher consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. This is a cross-sectional study comprised of adults from National Health Survey in 181 cities in Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru. Our travel time exposure variables are the city level average travel time and delay time, which are defined as the city level average travel time in traffic by car during peak hours, measured in minutes. Travel times were calculated in 2018 using the Google Maps distance matrix by selecting 30 random origin to destination pairs in each city, 4 morning peak hour measurements and 3 peak hour afternoon measurements for a typical weekday were taken. And for this analysis, travel times were rescaled to a 10-minute increase to facilitate interpretation. Our outcomes were the individual level vegetable and sugar-sweetened beverages consumption measured in days per week and categorized as rare, 1 day or less per week, medium, 2 to 4, or frequent, 5 or more days per week. And for sugar-sweetened beverages, this ordering was reversed to indicate a healthy diet. Our covariates are at the individual level: age, sex, education, and car availability in the household, and at the city level: population density, intersection density, adjusted gas price, presence of mass transportation options, city size, and the social environment index. We used multi-level ordinal logistic regression models for each outcome and exposures, with individuals nested within cities, including a random effect of the cities at the city level, and odds ratios were estimated. So model 1 included the exposure travel time plus the individual level confounders, age, sex, education, and car ownership. Model 2 additionally included the city level confounders, population density, intersection density, adjusted gas price, mass transportation, and city size. And in model 3, we added the social environment index. This table shows the individual level characteristics of the vegetable sample overall and by vegetable consumption groups, rare, medium, and frequent. And we see that female, older individuals, and also more educated individuals were more likely to have a greater vegetable consumption. And this table shows the city level characteristics of the vegetable sample. And we see that travel time was higher for those with a more frequent consumption of vegetables, in contrast to what we would expect. Although travel delay time was slightly lower for those with a more frequent consumption. In addition, we see a greater relationship with city size, population density, intersection density, presence of mass transport, and also with the social environment index. In this table, we see the characteristics of the sugar-sweetened beverages sample overall and by groups, frequent, medium, and rare. And again, we see that female, older people, and higher educated showing a healthier diet with a lower consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. And we also see that travel time was highest for those with a more rare consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. And for delay time, the pattern was not so clear. This table shows the odds ratios of dietary intake associated with travel time. And we found that after adjustments, the association was not significant for travel time, but it was for travel delay time, such that for a 10-minute increase in the delay time, there was a 45% lower odds of having a more frequent consumption of vegetables and a 35% lower odds of having a more rare consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages. During the analysis, we observed that the inclusion of the city size variable in the models showed the greatest impact in the estimates. So we decided to explore analysis stratified by city size tertiles. These were the city size tertiles, 1, 2, and 3, according to the city size area. And this figure shows the overall estimate as previously shown in red, and the stratified estimates by city size tertiles 1, 2, and 3. And we found that the association was greater and significant mainly for the larger cities. In summary, we found that lower travel times were associated with poor dietary intake in Latin American cities, and that this association was greater in the largest cities, which could be explained by factors related to the urban traffic, number of vehicles, and street density in these cities. Our main limitation is the lack of temporality between the exposure and outcome measures, because travel time data do not precede diet data. And also the time gap between the measures of dietary intake among different countries. This is our manuscript team, Guta, Binod, Dalia, Daniel, Carrie, Leticia, Mariana, Nancy, Olga, Xavi, and Chizi. And these are some proposed journals we plan to submit the paper. And thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. Another innovative, very unique. I paper for SALURBAL. Any comments and questions for Joanna? Anna? I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so this is really nice, Joanna. So this also makes me think, putting it in the context of the summaries that we talked about earlier. So there's this other paper by Xavi showing no association. I can't remember if it was travel time or travel delay, I think. I think it was with diabetes, I can't remember. So here there's a story, like there's no association, which is sort of expected because diabetes is, there's so many other factors that go into whether you develop diabetes, where here's a much more proximal relationship, which has to do with diet and the mechanisms that you talked about. So I think starting to put the new things in the context of the old things is really important for the study. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that I know I went through this super quickly, but using the harmonized diet data is something that we have not done very much with at all. And so you show some interesting results for this travel variable, but hidden in here, there are also some interesting results for other variables, like city size, perhaps other city characteristics, other individual level factors. And so I wonder if there's room for a broader descriptive paper that just describes dietary patterns across our cities and what factors are related to them, making use of the harmonized, very rich harmonized data that we have. So I think someone should propose that paper. That's it, but thank you. This is very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Anna. Another comment? Actually, adding to what Anna says of the stories that we are having, and as Anna put it, like it's probably not in a framework, but we're going to be constructing a framework related with all of this, is that transport. I mean, and again, it's travel delay, Daniel. It's travel delay, what it's really being associated with our outcomes. So this adds to the depression symptoms that we found with CC, that we found it we actually found it with travel delay, right? It was, if I remember correctly, which it seems to be more sensitive. And it's that time that we're not able to really, in our cities, that we cannot really predict, that we cannot control, that it's affecting our mental health, that it's affecting the way we consume. So I think this is very nice. It was just another comment that could add to the discussion. Because when we reviewed the literature, we didn't find many things with travel time. It was more with car ownership, which makes sense, which what you found, but nothing with travel delay. Josiah? But I don't know, want to comment something, Joanna, before we pass to Josiah? Josiah, I'm sorry.
That's okay. It is my turn.
Yeah, you go ahead, Josiah.
Yeah. Well, it's regarding the comment of Anna about which mechanisms may underlie the distribution of obesity and feeding patterns within a city. Well, I think that is somehow the literature points towards social class mechanisms, because I mean, people usually embody their social context. So food-related behaviors are embodied from childhood to adulthood as a social class habitus. We could say, if we use sociology terms. So when you live in a neighborhood where poverty is concentrated, that has an effect usually on obesity and mainly on women. So that's what the literature shows, and probably it's likely mediated by social status issues. I mean, when you have a lower social status and your neighborhood increases your individual disadvantage, what Ella and McIntyre call the deprivation amplification, that could be a potential mechanism. At least that's what I found analyzing Chilean data in a very, very small sample of 900 persons. But we could explain the independent effect of neighborhood disadvantage by body size dissatisfaction, which is a social status marker. So that indicates that likely the concentration of poverty probably grants women even a lower social position than the one that they would have if they would live in another neighborhood with the same income and educational status. So Chile is a very class segregated country. So I think that residential segregation patterns are quite important and that we should study them more in detail to see how that really affects the health of our populations. And likely the effects of car traveling, I would look at where cars are clustered within a city, because the cars are not randomly distributed across cities. I mean, you have a whole group that travels by public transport, clustered within one part of the city, and in another part of the city, you will have another cluster of people that travels by car. So that would be my comment in this regard. I'm sorry if I took too long.
Thank you, Luciana. Regarding your comment, your very interesting comment, we explored the social, whether the social environment index interacted with travel time in the travel time data association, but the interaction term was not significant. But I agree 100% with your comment. Thank you.
Rodrigo?
Hello, thank you, Joanna. I wonder if you have any information regarding travel mode in your surveys. I mean, because I agree with Olga that travel delay is what makes you, I mean, maybe to just get a sort of beverage in your journey, but do you have any information about travel modes? Because travel times walking, as a long journey walking, in my view, it maybe, I mean, you can forgive someone who's getting getting a beverage while walking, but maybe, I mean, do you have any information regarding that? Thank you. Or did you include this in your model?
So I'm sorry, I'm just going to comment on that. We don't have information on travel mode in the surveys. The best that we do have is the car availability in the household. So I think she did adjust for that, but in terms of actual person level travel time, we don't really have that.
Thank you.
And Amy and Usama, you had some questions on the analytical component. I don't know if you want to read that out loud or want to make a question.
Hi, it's Amy. I just a caution, the odds ratio is correct. I don't want to, when you're doing the logistic regression, it's not incorrect. It's just that we are often the reader, the lay reader, and sometimes we as well, often interpret odds ratio as probabilities, and our ability to speak in that language and think about them as probabilities is it departs a lot when the outcome is very prevalent. So I think in this analysis, it looked like the outcome may be, it was multinomial, but it looked like maybe the rare groups or the frequent groups in the comparison were greater than 45% or so prevalent. So you may get some pushback that the odds ratio so one way to account for this is to pick a category. Your outcome category is a lower prevalent category, and your referent category can be the higher prevalent category. That's one way to potentially help with that. Usama is also mentioning there's some other ways that you can analyze the data. It is a more complicated though for multinomial. So. But I think others in your work group probably can provide, in your author group could provide guidance, or we're happy to have any follow-up conversations if we want.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you to all the 3 great presenters of this afternoon. It was really nice. So since we cannot clap, join me clapping at least as a reaction here. Exactly, you can do that too. So thank you everybody for this presentations. And Claire, the floor is yours now.
All right, so that was the full agenda for today for the meeting, but we do have some time set aside. It's optional, but if you want to stay, I'm going to be breaking everyone up into the breakout rooms so that we can just have some time to talk and, you know, debrief about the presentations from today that we've heard. Yeah, so I think if you do not want to join the breakout rooms, you can sign off. But if you want to stay and chat, stay here and I will put everyone into breakout rooms. See the number dropping rapidly. But okay. Okay. So hopefully the people that are still on are the people that want to talk in small groups. So I'm going to create the breakout rooms now. And I'm going to let you choose your room in case you want to be in a room with someone specific. And then if you want to switch rooms, you should be able to return here if you want to. Okay, hold on a second. Okay. So I think now you should be able to see the rooms and join a room if you want to. Hopefully.
Where should we see them, Claire? I don't see them.
I don't know because I can only see as the host. But I
Claire,
see
click on breakout on the bottom panel. You might need to double click on the Zoom, the breakout room. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Amy. So just pick a room. Or if you want to be in a room with someone specific, you can message them. If you don't want to choose, I can assign you. So let me know.
Sorry, Claire, and how do we choose? Never did that before. Selection. Wow. Okay, I found it.
Okay, good. I can assign people to rooms if they want. Does anybody want me to assign them to a room?
We're such small rooms.
I know, yeah. Okay, so I know Anne said you wanted me to assign you to a room. Serena, you wanted me to assign you. Anybody else? We can move you to a room if you want me to. They will say rooms 3 and 4 are empty. So.
Oh, Claire, you can assign me anyway.
Okay, I
don't
will
know
assign you.
how to do.
Okay,